A train is a simple thing at first glance. A locomotive or several pull a string of cars along a railroad. But not all those rail cars are equal, and there are some fascinating details if you take a minute to notice their differences. I'm about to start a deep dive series on railway engineering, but I thought before I do that, we should cover some of the basics first. How many of these cars have you spotted before? I'm Grady, and this is Practical Engineering. Let's get started. All trains have at least one locomotive that provides the power. They can pull from the front, called the head of the train, push from the tail, or act as so-called distributed power, somewhere in between. There's a ton of types of locomotives, but they deserve their own video, so today I'll focus mainly on the unpowered cars they push or pull. We'll start with passenger cars, move on to freight, and then talk about a few of the more unusual cars you might be lucky enough to spot on the rails. Unless you work in the railroad industry, passenger trains are the only ones you'll ever get a chance to interact with. The standard passenger car, or coach, is what you've probably seen the most of. Aisle in the center with rows of seats on either side. Some coach cars can be disconnected and rearranged, but most modern passenger cars come in train sets that are rarely split up in normal operation. Some passenger cars are bi-level, also called double-decker. This can double the capacity of a car, but it's kind of rare. That's not only because of height and weight restrictions on railroads, but also because the added time it takes to load and unload the cars can cause congestion at busy stations. Long-haul passenger trains may include a baggage car for checked luggage like the cargo hold of an airliner. In most cases, they're designed to look like the rest of the passenger cars, although often with fewer windows since bags rarely enjoy the view. Combine cars have a section for passengers and one for luggage or freight. Although tricky to identify from the outside, a common sight on passenger trains is a diner car, essentially a rolling restaurant. These cars give rise to the quintessential American restaurant of the same name, many of which are converted rail cars themselves. Some passenger routes even have a lounge car, a bar on rails that sometimes even has live music. If you're sleepy after dinner, you might find yourself in a sleeper car. Open section cars have the beds and bunks with only a curtain for privacy. Most modern sleeping cars have private rooms and bathrooms akin to rolling hotels. These days, especially in the US, passenger rail is used by people who find the journey itself to be the destination. Some passenger trains include dome cars for better sightseeing along the trip. A bulbous glass dome provides a panoramic view from the side of the car. Similarly, observation cars are sometimes included at the end of the train to give passengers a view out the back. Of course, we can't forget crew cars. All trains have a team of people who work aboard for operation, maintenance, and other tasks, and they sometimes need their own quarters for breaks or sleep. Especially in areas like Australia, where there are huge stretches of rail without stops at cities, a whole second crew might wait in the crew car ready to swap when the working time limits of the first crew are reached. Passenger trains are cool, of course, but I'm more of a freight train rail fan myself. There's just something awesome about seeing a single car weighing sometimes more than 100 tons move almost effortlessly down steel rails. And with the huge variety of types of freight that move over land, come a huge variety of railcars. Boxcars are a common sight with their huge sliding doors. They can be loaded by hand or forklift and accommodate a wide range of sizes and types of cargo that require protection from the elements. And they have a few variations too. A refrigerated boxcar is exactly what it sounds like, a giant insulated fridge or freezer on rails. They usually feature a diesel-powered refrigeration system that's easy to spot from the outside. If the goods being transported in a boxcar are relatively light, you end up completely filling the car before coming close to its weight capacity, sometimes called cubing out the car. To maximize the use of a boxcar for lightweight cargo, there are taller versions called high cubes. Not all railroads can fit such a tall car because of tunnels or bridges, so you might see the excess height portion of the car marked in white to make sure it doesn't inadvertently end up on a route without the necessary clearance. If you want a train car full of cars, then you're looking for an auto rack, designed to carry consumer cars and trucks. Many have 3 levels and carry dozens of vehicles at once. Freight rail moves automobiles cheaper and with better protection compared to driving each one individually from factories to distribution centers. A few passenger trains pull auto racks as well, like the Auto Train between Washington, D.C. and Orlando. You can take your car on your rail trip and have it at your destination. When it comes to freight cars, it doesn't get much more straightforward than a flat car. A simple name for a simple function. just a rolling platform that can be used for all sorts of cargo, especially big stuff that needs to be loaded with a hoist or crane, and cargo that can handle a little rain or snow. You might see flat cars used to transport heavy equipment and machinery, pipes or steel beams, or even see multiple flat cars outfitted to transport enormous wind turbine blades. Some flat cars feature bulkheads at the front and rear. These help keep loads like steel plates, pipes, and wood products from shifting forwards or backwards when the train accelerates or brakes. Another flat car variant is the centerbeam car, used to haul lumber, plywood, wallboard, and fencing. The central beam helps stiffen the car, making it possible to stack products higher. It also provides a place to secure loads from either side of the car. Some centerbeam railcars hold enough lumber to frame out half a dozen houses. Flat cars are also used for intermodal shipping, or using more than one mode of transportation, like trucks, trains, and ships. Trailer on flat car, or TOFC, isn't exactly a distinct type of railcar, but it is a distinct use of one. A semi-trailer is lifted or driven onto a flat car at one terminal, and it's ready to connect back to a truck once it reaches the next intermodal facility to be driven to its final destination. This is sometimes called piggybacking, and it can be a cheaper alternative than trucking the trailer for its entire route. Most intermodal freight these days comes in containers, standardized steel boxes that fit on trucks, trains, and ships. Container on flat car, or COFC, again, isn't a different kind of car, but simply a specialized use. The cast corners of steel containers have holes that make them easy to secure with latches or twist lock devices, so they can be quickly loaded and unloaded. One of the great advantages of containerization is that modern intermodal containers can be stacked. An interbox connector slots between the corner castings and holds each box together. But you don't see double-stacked containers on flat cars very often because of height restrictions and issues with center of gravity. Instead, Railcars recess the bottom of a container between the wheels, lowering the top of a double stack and making it safer at speed. Not every line has the clearance, but Railcars have made it possible to double stack intermodal freight on a lot more routes than before. Coils of sheet metal are used in countless manufacturing processes, so you can see them on freight railroads fairly frequently in coil cars. Steel coils are challenging to load and unload and challenging to secure as well, so that's why they get their own specialized cars. Many are covered with a hood to protect the steel or other metal cargo from the elements. Gondola cars, or gondola depending on where you live, are used for bulk materials like scrap metal, sand, ore, and coal. They're basically enormous wagons. Gondolas have to be loaded and unloaded from the top with a crane or bucket. Some can be turned upside down and unloaded using a rotary dumper. Look for the different color of paint on the side with the rotary coupler. Upper cars are like gondolas in that they're loaded from the top, but they have sloped sides and bottoms that funnel material so they can be unloaded through hatches at the bottom. Hoppers can have open tops when carrying loads that aren't sensitive to weather, but covered hoppers are used for cargo that needs protection from the elements, like sugar and grains. Another option for unloading bulk goods is to tip it sideways. This is a side dump car, but not very common to see. They're mostly used to maintain the railroad itself rather than move and deliver bulk goods to customers. The next car is very rare, but it's so cool I just had to include it. Behold the behemoth that is the Schnabel car. These are actually two cars with far more axles than normal, each sporting a heavy lift arm for truly enormous cargo, such as power transformers used in substations. One of the largest of these is used in the US to transport nuclear reactor containment vessels on 36 axles. Tank cars are used to carry liquids and gases on rails. Like all rail cars, there are plenty of variations, but in general, they're split up into two types. Non-pressurized tank cars handle all kinds of liquids from milk to oil. They may have specialized coatings that match their specific cargo needs, can be insulated or even refrigerated, and they usually have a bottom out so they can unload by gravity. Pressurized cars are designed to transport liquids and gases under pressure. These tanks have thicker walls and higher standards for containment of cargo. Pressurized cars always have protective housings covering the fittings on top of the tank. But some non-pressurized cars have them too, so you'll have to look for other subtle clues or memorize the DOT classification numbers to know which type each one is for sure. Tank cars designed for hazardous cargo are heavily regulated and have special features like reinforced ends called head shields, specialized couplings that reduce the impacts of the derailment, and pressure relief valves to minimize the chances of an explosion. I can't be totally comprehensive for this short video. If you can dream it, there's probably a freight rail car of it somewhere, but that should be all the ones you're likely to see in the wild, plus a few you'd be really lucky to spot. But passenger and freight cars aren't the only things you'll see on the tracks. Non-revenue cars are those used by railroad companies themselves. After all, building and maintaining railroads is a complicated and expensive endeavor, and it takes a lot of interesting equipment to do it well. I'll rattle some of these off, but every railroad is different in the type of equipment they use to keep things running smoothly. Ballast is the name for the gravel bedding that railroad ties sit on. It distributes the enormous pressure of trains to the subgrade, provides lateral support to keep tracks from sliding side to side, and facilitates drainage to keep the subgrade from getting soggy. Ballast tampers shake and pack the ballast under the tracks, restoring the support if the ballast is settled, and sometimes correcting the rail alignment too. Ballast regulators use blades and brushes to distribute the ballast material evenly around the tracks and keep excess ballast from covering the ties. A ballast cleaner picks up all the rock, separates it from any dirt, and replaces it on the tracks to improve its ability to drain one and lock together to support the railroad. Rail grinders do just that, grind the rails to restore their shape and remove irregularities that show up as rails wear down. A tie exchanger takes out the old ties and inserts new ones without having to remove the rails. A spiker drives the spikes that hold the rails tightly to the ties. A railroad crane is used for heavy lifting along the rails where it might be difficult to access with an overland crane. Some railways in the north use a rotary snowplow during severe winter weather to keep the tracks clear. Sometimes you might see a work truck driving around on regular old paved roads with an extra set of flanged metal wheels. This is a road rail vehicle, also called high rail, since they can run both on the highway and the railroad. There's a whole host of high rail vehicles out there. Really any kind of work truck setup you can imagine on the highway could find itself doing work on the railroad. And this is probably the only rail vehicle you'll have a chance of seeing without also seeing a railroad itself. Railroads depend on large scales to measure the weight of equipment and cargo. And of course, if you got a scale, you need a way to calibrate, which is where the scale test car comes into play. These cars are basically rolling hunks of metal with very precisely known weights, kind of like a huge railroad version of the little weights you might have used in school science classes. A particularly rare car that you'd be lucky to see is a track geometry car. They carefully measure the gauge, position, curvature, and alignment of the railroad, helping to ensure the safety and smoothness of the tracks without interrupting service. Unlike manual measurements of rail geometry, the measurements of track geometry cars account for loading conditions, since the car itself is a full-scale railroad car. And finally, bringing up the rear, a train car we've all heard of, but one you really don't see too much of anymore, the caboose. Historically, cabooses housed crew members who had a host of jobs, from helping with switching and shunting cars around to looking for damaged cars, dangling equipment, monitoring brake line air pressure, and spotting overheating bearings and axles. With the advent of roller bearings and wayside defect detectors, the role of the caboose was diminished, and eventually the laws requiring them on trains were relaxed. Today, the last car of a freight train is often just a regular cargo car, but with a small device on the back called an end-of-train device. The most sophisticated versions monitor brake line pressure and movement of the back of the train, relaying the information to the engineer at the head. And the flashing red light lets anyone know that that's the whole train and there aren't any cars inadvertently left behind on the tracks. Trains are one of the most fascinating engineered systems in the world, and they're out there right in the open for anyone to have a look. Once you start paying attention, it's pretty satisfying to look for all the different types of rail cars that show up on the tracks.